Hi everybody. We're gonna be taking quick notes today, kind of doing a little station stuff in the classroom today. So kind of gonna walk stuff that we're gonna be going over today. So some new stuff. Today you will be, or some of you guys will be working on test correction stuff. Others will be working on this, and we'll do some website stuff as well. So working on a little hodgepodge of different things. All right. So anyway, so we just finished World War One. We learned about all of the effects of World War One. After the war, on how that's going to cause mass chaos. A lot of bitter feelings. Germany, obviously, they are humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Think of Brat. They were blamed for the war. They had to sign a war guilt clause. They had to pay all those war reparations, over $130 billion. They had to reduce their army, reduce their territory. That's not to mention all the money they spent during the war. So the German economy is going to be absolutely obliterated. Italy, same thing. They're on our side during the war, but they're left bitter too because they didn't get some of the things that they were promised, some of the land that they thought they were going to get. Russia, they were upset. They fought the war of 3 years, as we learned about with the Russian Revolution, a poor economy, poor leadership, millions of deaths. War was fought on the Eastern Front. So they have a bunch of stuff going through, and they felt bitter too because they lost some land that they thought were hoping that the Allies were going to maybe be nice and give them back. They didn't. Japan, they were on our side during the war. They were upset as well in terms of the treaty. All right, so that leads us into now our road to the Great Depression, as you see by the slides. So some of the things you will need to write down. There will be an exit ticket on this that you'll be off the lecture and off of this that you'll need to check for learning, I guess. The Great Depression won't happen until about 10 years after World War One. So we're going to talk about how that will lead to that. All right. So first thing. All right. So after World War One, the United States experienced significant growth. Basically, the complete opposite, guys, of Europe. Again, the war was fought in Europe. The war will devastate them. Most of the countries were in the war for 4 years. We're in for one. So I guess this is kind of where America begins to transition a little bit, where there were some European powers who were ahead of us economically. But after the war, those European powers who were ahead of us, they go backwards because the war will absolutely crumble their economy. Whereas the United States, we're going to spring ahead of them and become arguably the greatest economic power in the world after World War One, for the reasons that I highlighted earlier. Because the war wasn't fought here, we were only in it for a year. So we experienced significant economic growth. Our farmers were booming because, again, why? Trench warfare over in Europe. Farmers over there were buying U.S. products. Same for our factories. They were untouched. European powers were buying U.S. products. So we were absolutely booming. Good to go. So we took advantage of the European countries to rebuild. So we began to mass produce consumer goods, as we'll see in a second, like vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, ovens, cars, you name it. People began to invest in the stock market. Again, stock market's a risky game. I don't want to get into it, but people had more money to spend. They were working, making more money, able to spend in leisurely goods, as you see up here with the picture. Vacuum cleaners, they were able to buy cars and washer machines. So our factories are booming, people were working, things were good. Then you lead into this culture of the 20s. Again, people have more time on their hands. Unions began making more progress in the United States. Women liberation. Women got the right to vote after World War One. So there was these women called flappers. I don't want to get into it because it's mostly a U.S. thing. But more women began to step outside of the house. It was kind of their expectation before the war. They were housewives, took care of the kids, took care of the house. Now many women, the war allowed them to experience other things that they normally didn't do before. So these flappers, they cut their hair shorter, they wore shorter dresses, they smoked cigarettes, they were rather promiscuous, dated very loosely, I guess you can say it. So the woman began to change. Then you have the invention of movies became developed, talking movies. So the movie theater became much bigger. You have the cars. Many more people had access to vehicles in the United States because, again, they had more money to spend. So the cost of the cars went down from $800 in 1906 to about $200 by 1920s. And you have baseball. Babe Ruth put baseball on the map. New York Yankees, Sultan of SWAT, the King of Crash, the Great Bambino, or as Sandlot Smalls called, the Great Bambi. Yeah, don't make that call. So so there were a lot more leisurely things to do because people had more money to spend, and that's where things are going to come crashing down. Stock market crash in 1929. They call it Black Tuesday. Now, why did the stock market crash? There were many things that led to it. It just didn't happen overnight, over a week or a month or a year. Things that over a 10-year period that were kind of brought us to where we're at. One, people were buying stocks with credit. Not a good idea. So they're going to a bank, taking out a loan, and investing that loan into the stock market. And for those that know anything about the stock market, it's a risky business. If your stock crashes, you lose all your money. Well, the banks want their money. Their lenders want their money. So people were playing a very risky game with that by taking out loans. That was a big, big problem that people were doing, trying to get rich quick. Two, so kind of going back to what I said earlier. So the economy was going well, factories were producing. The problem was they were overproducing. So basically what started happening after 5-6 years after World War I is that European markets began to rebound. They became less reliant on American products. So our factories keep pumping out more goods. Well, what happens to the price of goods when there's too much of it? Price goes down. So that's not good for farmers. If the price of their vegetables or fruits or products that they make, if they decrease, they're not making any money. Therefore, they can't pay back their loans they took out for equipment and for more land. So many farms had to close down or make cuts. Factories, same thing. The price of goods dipped. So that wasn't good either. So people couldn't pay back their loans. Banks, problem. And then 3, this is more of a banking issue. You can still argue it still goes on today. Banks were giving out loans to people, easy credit, easy loans. And some of them were risky. And, when people lost their jobs, they said 1 and 2, people lost their money in the stock market. The banks were, they were on the hook. They lent all this money that they weren't getting repaid. So banks began to shut down, basically. So guys, the Great Depression wasn't just a U.S. event. It was a worldwide event. So think about this. Things were already so bad in Europe as it was. Then you compound that with the Great Depression. That's 20-something years of basically all-out poverty and chaos that's going to ensue. People are going to be very, very desperate in Europe because they go through some very tough times. You see some pictures here in the United States about war veterans, World War I. They're looking for a job. Again, there were people that worked their whole lives that were former lawyers, lost their job, or worked in the factory. They wanted to work, but there was nothing for them. Hooverville, the president of the United States was President Herbert Hoover, and so they named these Hoovervilles after him. So this is a picture of Central Park in New York City. So for those that have seen Home Alone, this is what it looked like during the 30s, during the Depression. These Hoovervilles were like makeshift homes made of cardboard, wood, scrap material, and this was basically a village of where people live for the homeless. They named him after Hoover because people made fun of him or blamed him for starting the Depression, although that's still unfair, but that's for next year. We'll talk more about that. So charities and local governments began helping some of these people that were, in need. So they set up bread lines. You guys see by that picture here, soup kitchens and bread lines. People needed food, and some charities would step in and provide bread to the people, or soup, or small meals to help the homeless or those that were in need. Here's a picture of a mom and their kids, living in a tent, basically, not knowing where the next meal is going to come from. You see a lack of hope here. And that's, a lot of people experience that, not just a couple, but millions upon millions of people were really going through a rough time. All right, last but not least, for what you need, Herbert Hoover will run for president in 1932 against FDR. Herbert Hoover, very unpopular. He's going to lose in a landslide to Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR for short. FDR will serve a 4-term president. And why is that weird? Well, today, all presidents are able to serve 2. And the reason why that started with FDR, he ran for 4 consecutive terms. He won them all. He was very popular for the most part. So he served from 1932 to 1945. He will die shortly into his 4th term. He was very sick throughout most of his presidency. He had polio. Basically, what that means is that it attacks your muscles. You become paralyzed. You can't walk. So throughout most of his presidency, or all of his presidency, he was in a wheelchair. So he was very, very, very sick. But he led the United States through the Great Depression, through World War II. As I said, he developed polio. He was the first president to use the radio to his advantage. Again, the late 20s when the radio became really big. So he used that platform to speak to the masses. Very similar to today what Trump does on Twitter. I mean, he uses social media to his advantage to reach his base, to get kind of with all Americans be accessible. Well, that's what he did with what he had at the time, which is the radio, to be able to mass transit a lot of information out to the people. So he hosted his own radio programs and talked about his plans for how he was going to get people out of the Great Depression. So they call them fireside chats, basically his radio program. All right, last but not least, his plan to get us out of the Depression was something called the New Deal. Very, very important, very controversial. Many of these cases were taken to the Supreme Court as ruled as unconstitutional, or at least challenged. The big problem was what is the role of the government? Is it the federal government's job to fix poverty, to fix homelessness, or is it the state and charities and local governments? So whose job, federal or state? That's the million-dollar question. And ultimately, that's the big debate amongst Republicans and Democrats. Throughout the 1920s in the United States, Republicans held power. However, that changed when the stock market crashed. Herbert Hoover, as I mentioned earlier, he wasn't really doing a whole lot in terms of the federal government. He didn't believe that it was the federal government's job to do all of these relief programs. Well, when FDR was campaigning against Herbert Hoover, he basically said the complete opposite. He said, yes, it is the federal government's role to help out the American people. So he created this New Deal program, hundreds of programs that he created to create jobs, to restructure banks, to fix the banking problems, and to save people from losing their homes, fixing lenders and different rules of that nature. So again, he created hundreds of programs knowing that not all of them were going to work. But if you throw enough darts at the dartboard, some of them are going to stick. Some of them are not. Some of them are going to stick. So that was ultimately his plan. All right. So that wraps it up for the lecture for today. Your next step is going to be completing the exit ticket to finish out off what you just learned. Let me know if you have any questions.